is INHABIT, first of all? The Invasive Species Habitat Tool is a web application that includes both maps and tabular summaries of those maps of habitat suitability models for 220 terrestrial plant species. And the species included are ones that were selected by managers. And the models are for the contiguous United States. And so this web tool is really the product of a science practitioner partnership to help guide management actions, including both watch lists and targeted species. So this web tool is being built by a large group of people that have contributed a lot, both behind the scenes in developing the models. And then, as I mentioned, it's really a science practitioner partnership. And so we've also had a lot of input from people at different land management agencies who've provided input on, as I mentioned, the species that are included, but also what the products are and how those products are delivered. And INHABIT really started from my research group at USGS sitting down with the National Park Service invasive species coordinators and talking about what kind of expertise we had within our group and what needs the Park Service, and particularly the invasive plant management teams that they have, really needed. And so this started with a meeting in 2018 with that group within the Park Service, and then over time has developed into what we have today through various stakeholder meetings and presentations like this to get input from others and explain kind of what we've done so far. So here's the screenshot of the Invasive Species Habitat Tool as it exists today. And as I mentioned earlier, there's currently 220 species within it, mapped in tabular summaries. And those tabular summaries include what we call ranked risks that summarize across species for a unit and integrate suitability predictions with known occurrences. And so with the screenshot, you can see there's a tab at the top where you can view mapped outputs, and then there's this management area table tab where you can look at those. So what are habitat suitability models? What do I mean when I talk about this? And so the way that these models are created is that we have occurrence data, and we really rely on great resources like EDD maps, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, data sets collected by different agencies for those occurrence information. And so we get data from all of those different databases and aggregate those together. And then we've created a suite of predictor variables for the US at a 90-meter resolution that include things that we think might be important for different species. And we put these all together in a model algorithm that comes up with mathematical relationships that we can use to then make a map and say whether we think a location is suitable or not for a species. And so we really spent a lot of time developing the predictor set that we have. And so these include atmospheric water from different times of the year, potential biotic interactions, so like tree cover to get at shade information, other things like that, disturbance, including human disturbance, landscape water, solar radiation, the substrate, so what the soils are like, temperature from different seasons and times of the year, and then topography to get at where, again, that gets at solar radiation and where water might pool on the landscape. And one thing I'll say about the predictors is that, again, we've really taken to heart input from land managers themselves. And so with the initial iteration of INHABIT models, we were talking with Fish and Wildlife refuge managers, and they didn't feel like we were doing a really good job at capturing where water was on the landscape. And that's really important for where wildlife refuges are across the country, and especially the West, where the habitats can be pretty different within the refuges than the surrounding landscape because of that water. And so through discussions with them, we developed some new predictors that we thought would better capture that information. And so the second version of INHABIT models included those, and the managers thought that those models did a lot better. So we're really looking for feedback on how these models might be improved and what might be missing from them as well. So where do INHABIT map values come from? So if you think about climate change assessments, they're typically based on multiple models, and it's similar for species distribution models. And so we have different algorithms that have different ways of predicting where things might be on the landscape. And then we also have potential bias in where data is collected. So if you think of the type of data in EDD maps, you're probably going to get a lot more information from areas near where people live and places that are closer to roads and easier to get to than really remote locations, just because you have more people there looking for species. And so we try to account for that as well. And so we end up with 10 different potential habitat suitability maps that we then combine to come up with what we serve on the website. And then another piece of that is we try to look at where we're extrapolating to novel environments, or and let the user decide whether they want to do that or not. And all that means, if you think of a species that we have data for that's maybe invasive in Florida but not found elsewhere in the country, we may be extrapolating beyond the temperature conditions found in Florida when we're making predictions to North Dakota. And while we might not expect a species found in Florida to survive in North Dakota, having an idea of where you might draw that bound of where you're extrapolating beyond those environmental conditions where you have occurrence data can be something you may want to look at. So I want to just walk through 3 different INHABIT use cases, and these are ones that have been identified by land manager partners. And so these use cases include where to search for new populations. So I have an example of where new populations of fountain grass were found in Joshua Tree National Park. Another use case is what species are regional early detection rapid response species, or what species may be at the doorstep of a unit. And so I have an example of watch lists for an individual management unit that's based on summaries of models for all 220 INHABIT species. And then a third example is thinking about how much worse could it get. And so with this, someone compared the current known distribution to INHABIT potential distribution for individual species that they were concerned about. So here's the first example species. So this is showing a map for Joshua Tree National Park with the model for fountain grass being displayed. And so the darker red color indicates a higher likelihood of suitability for fountain grass. And so there's this green box on the map is what's highlighted in the image below. And so here the park had not looked in that area yet for fountain grass. And they went and did surveys there, and these green points are where they found populations of fountain grass. And so in this case, the model kind of guided them to where there might be more populations for the species that they're wanting to control. And so that helps inform downstream stakeholders. And so that could help with plant watch lists for volunteer botanists accessing parts of a park or other management unit. And so how does the mapping application on the website work? So here's again a screenshot of the website, and there's a drop-down menu here where you can select from the 220 species included. And there's also this location to click where you could download the map to use in GIS on your own computer. And then we have 3 different maps that you can look at. One is a more targeted map versus a more that has more restricted as far as what's defined as suitable habitat versus a more comprehensive, more inclusive model for species. And then you can either turn on or off environmental extrapolation. So here it's turned on, and that's why a lot of the country is gray for this species that's being shown. You can also display the data that we use to develop the model to get an idea of where we had occurrence points that went into the model. And then also displaying a range polygon around that. And then finally, we have this area where you can choose to display management unit polygons. And so you could type in, for example, Great Smokies Mountains National Park, and it would zoom into that park for you to see that. And the types of management polygons we have on the website right now include counties, national parks, fish and wildlife refuges, BLM lands, and Forest Service lands. But that's another thing that if people have management units that they think would be useful to see within this tool, we can easily expand that. So before going on to the next case study example, I wanted to briefly mention the INHABIT species coverage. So what species do we have included within INHABIT? And so, as I mentioned before, INHABIT species are those suggested by managers. And what I did here was just compared state listed plant species to plant species that are modeled within INHABIT, and display that in a couple different ways. And so the top image here has the percent of listed species for a state that are included within INHABIT, whereas the bottom one is the actual count of species that are listed within a state and also modeled within INHABIT. And so you can see different patterns here. And I guess this is I just wanted to mention that this is a great time to suggest additional species. We're getting ready to do another round of modeling for INHABIT. And so if you have any thoughts on species that you think should be included, we'd love to have those. Okay, so moving on and thinking of watch lists. So many counties have habitat suitability for a large number of species. So for example, in the map that I have here, of the 220 species that we've modeled, it's showing the count of those 220 species that have suitability within a county within the Southeast region. And so you can see there's a lot of a pretty high number for a lot of counties, which is maybe more than someone want to think about managing or trying to manage for or search for. So the next step that we took was looking at, of those species with suitability, how many of them are already known to be present by one of those data sources I mentioned that we used earlier. So are there records for the county in EDD maps or in one of these other data systems? And so we can see there's somewhat fewer species on the list for each county here, but there's still a lot of them there. So another way that we can look at this is by looking at what species are at the doorstep. And so what we have defined for a species being at the doorstep is a species that has suitability, so suitable habitat within a unit. There's no records inside that unit for the species, but there are records within 50 miles, or we could change it and be within 100 miles. And so that really reduces the number of species that you might be on the lookout for, but it's also species that people are concerned about somewhere you may not have yet, but are nearby. And so those may be a good kind of local EDR species to try to keep from really becoming established within your unit. Thinking more about like what's on the horizon more broadly, the other way that we've looked at this is thinking of kind of regional early detection rapid response species. So what species have suitability within a management unit, but haven't been recorded in the region, the entire region at all. And so here, I have the number of species with suitability in a county that haven't yet been recorded within any of the states within this Southeast region. And so these are just different ways that we can take those tabular summaries and come up with watch lists that might be useful for different purposes. And so here's an example of a doorstep list for Great Smoky Mountain National Park, where there's 174 of 220 species that had some suitable habitat somewhere within Great Smoky Mountain National Park. 120 of those hadn't been recorded yet in the park, but only 50 of those have records within 50 miles and haven't been recorded in the park. So that's a much smaller list. And of those 50 species, 13 of those have suitability in greater than 10% of the park. And so maybe those are kind of the highest priority species that you might want to be on the lookout for. And one thing we found with these lists is that the management units themselves may know that some of these species are actually already known to be within their unit. But feedback that we've received so far is that people have still found it useful because they know, oh, wait, I know this is already here. I can take that off the list. But it still leaves them with something they can use. And so within the website, the way that this information can be obtained is by clicking on the management tab. And here we have this ranked risk view on. And so you select the unit that you're interested in, and it provides summary information for that particular unit. And you can download the data set from here as well with metadata information. And then if you have the ranked risk view off, what you can do is select a particular species. And so this has summary information for all different management unit types within INHABIT. So again, counties, parks, refuges, Forest Service units, and BLM, and then it's summaries for that single species. And then that could also be filtered to a single state. So say I want summary information for air potato in Georgia, then you could do that here and then download that list. So the third kind of case study that we've had managers mention to us is using the information within INHABIT to help inform how much worse could things get. And so this particular example is from Wyoming, because there's a person with Wyoming Extension Office who used INHABIT potential suitable habitat information for, I think it was 13 species. And then they, from county managers, they had information on the knowledge of current infestations, and they looked at the difference between those to assess future potential. And this is also an area where future climate could come in, looking at how that even that future potential might change with changing climates. So I also wanted to talk about kind of new directions that INHABIT's moving in at the moment. So INHABIT is one project that's part of this National Early Detection Rapid Response Framework. And as part of this, we're developing global extent models. And so how that's different from I'll talk a little bit more about how that's different from what we have right now. Another thing that we're looking at is thresholded abundance models, and then also predicting current distributions. And so for global extent models, there's a lot of new invasive species that often have too few occurrences within the US to model. So wavy leaf basket grass was one species that was requested back in 2019 as a species to model, but there's not enough occurrence locations within the US yet to really develop a good model. We can never fit a good one. And so what we're doing instead is producing models right now using global occurrence records and then applying those to the US. And so we can create a model like this example one up here and then apply it to the US to get information on potential suitable habitat. And again, species suggestions for this are coming from local experts and then also from horizon scanning efforts. And again, we're always happy to receive suggestions of species to include here. And one of the big differences with these models from the ones currently in INHABIT is the ones in INHABIT right now are 90-meter resolution, but these global models will be at a 1-kilometer resolution. The other thing that we're looking at is abundance information. And so where this comes in as being important is if you think of species that's really problematic in the West and everybody's really concerned about is cheatgrass. But that species is found in all 50 states, but we don't really care about it in the Eastern US because it doesn't really become abundant and have impacts. And so by focusing in on where species might become abundant, we could further reduce lists in that way. And so occurrence models only may overestimate suitability for abundance. So here's an example where we have an environment 1, environment 2, where anywhere a species occurs could be suitable for high density invasion. But there could be some species where the environments where species might become abundant are a subset of those where the species can occur. And so that's what we're doing right now is trying to create models predicting abundance categories. And so we're not creating a true abundance model, mostly because the data just isn't there. So a lot of information that we have for abundance is more cover class information for species rather than true percent cover estimates. And then there's also not, for a lot of species, there's not enough of a range of occurrences with different levels of abundance to develop a true model. And so what we're doing is saying, where are all the locations where the species occurs at 5% cover or greater? And we can make a model for that. Where are all the locations the species occurs at 25% cover or greater and make a model for that? And so there's a couple examples on the right, the top one being where a model was created for occurrence. It's shown in gold, and blue is where the species had 10% cover or greater. And so this is an example where that was really a subset. And then the one on the bottom is where we had models at different thresholds of abundance. So 5% or greater, 10%, 25. And so you can see how that, again, kind of further subsets where we might want to look for a species or be concerned about a species. And then one other piece that we have is using remotely sensed imagery with models of phenology for a species to really detect where it occurs on the landscape. And so this is just an example of cheatgrass using differences from when cheatgrass is brown down to when the native vegetation is still green. And this is something that we can use in the Eastern US, for example, with some of the invasive shrub species that keep their leaves longer than than the native species. Okay, so thinking about climate change and extending beyond just where invasive species are abundant. My research group's been working with some folks at the Northeast CASC and with the Northeast Risk Group to use these same methods, but only use climate data as the predictors, and creating models for current climate and future climate. And so that's the example here, as we have the number of species with suitability under current climate conditions and the number of species with suitability under future climate conditions. And the one, I think the biggest caveat with this particular research is that we only used US locations to develop the models. And so when you look at a place like Florida, that's really limiting, because a lot of the species that may be moving into southern Florida with changing climates are ones that aren't necessarily going to be found in the US yet. So we really need to be including species at a broader extent in the US to get good information for that. But one thing we were able to look at with this is how range centroids may be shifting with changing climate. And so what we're, this graph on the right is showing each dot represents the centroid of a species range under current climate conditions, with the arrow indicating the shift in that centroid with 2 degrees increase in 2 degrees C. And so a lot of species are shifting their ranges to the north and east. And so with this information, we can, there's now some county summaries available on EDD maps from this work showing, where species are now and where they might be with this 2 degree C shift. Another project we're currently working on looks at range shifting for potential for aquatic invaders. And this is a project that we're partnering with Wes Daniel and the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database. And the study area for this is really focused on the Northeast, but we're making models for the entire US. And this is for 100 invasive species that are currently established in the Southeast or the Midwest that with shifting climates may move into that Northeast region. And so again, they're similar models to INHABIT, but we're including future climate scenarios in addition to pathways for how species might spread to these new areas that become suitable with changing climate. And that work, we're just starting the, we'll be starting the modeling process for that this summer. So hopefully there'll be some models available by next spring from this work. And so I didn't really have any great examples of showing implications for invasion threat with climate change and these habitat suitability models like what we have in INHABIT, even though we're moving towards that. So I wanted to quickly go through this example of work that I've done with tegu lizards in the Southeast. And so this is work with some colleagues at USGS who have more of a background in herpetology. And this is building on some work I did with an even larger group that was published in 2018, developing habitat suitability models based on tegu lizard native range and applying those to the US. But what we did here is we're extending that previous modeling work, considering changing climates and comparing that with thermal studies, with an overwinter study and extended range documentation. So really honing in on what we've learned about the species as well in the intervening 5 years. So here are habitat suitability models for the 3 species of tegu lizards that are common in the pet trade in their native ranges in South America. And one thing that we found very interesting here is if you look at the climatic conditions where those 3 different species are found, there are very distinct differences between the species. And so the predictors that we ended up considering for this were annual precipitation, mean annual potential evapotranspiration, mean winter temperature, and the warmest month temperature. And so we developed those models for South America. We applied them to the US. So here you can see the relative habitat suitability within the United States for those 3 different species of tegu lizards. And what I'm showing down here at the bottom is the accumulation of sightings of the 3 different species within EDD maps over the last 20 or so years. And so you can see that they're increasing over time. And so we have the models for current conditions, and we applied it to a +2 degrees C scenario and also a +4 degrees scenario. And so we can see that for the black and white tegu lizard, which is well established in Florida, there's definitely a northward movement in suitability, with the southern tip of Florida having a decreased suitability. But for these other species, there's increased potential suitability in the southern tip of Florida. And so for the black and white, what I really want to focus in on here is where there are sightings of tegu lizards relative to climatic conditions. And so these northernmost sightings are in areas that have, somewhat lower predicted suitability. But if we look at that with changing climate, there's predictions to have increased suitability in those locations. And so those are likely areas that people do really want to be aware of tegus, potentially have public education campaigns to make people aware of the potential issues and really focus on trying to prevent those populations from well establishing and expanding. So from this type of work, we can see that areas where tegu suitability was predicted to be high from our original work in 2018 are indeed suitable. So those are areas that tegus have since moved into and established. And another important consideration is looking across all 3 species because of the climatic distinctions between those species. And we don't really know if the climatic distinctions are because of true physiological differences between the species, or is it competitive exclusion between them? And so they may actually be able to survive in some of those other climatic conditions. And then with the black and white tegu in particular, some of the information from studies that have recently occurred show that its ability to thermoregulate facilitates its advance northward. And so that could be a reason why it's a relatively good invader. And while suitability in South Florida for the black and white tegu declines, it increases for the other 2 tegu species. And so likely tegus are still, something that Southern Florida is going to need to be concerned about. And also, since that original 2018 publication, some southeastern states have passed regulations banning black and white tegus, but climate change scenarios show an increase of risk in those farther north areas. And so that may be something that some of those other states may need to be considering. So with that, that's all the slides I have now, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
All right, thank you, Catherine. Folks, you can put your questions in the chat, and I can get started with one here. There we go. I was just curious, when you're talking about the georeferenced data, your thoughts on iNaturalist and how reliable those points are. Because I'm starting to see people saying we can use them if they're research grade, but I'm also hearing others explain how they're validated, and it doesn't necessarily sound too reliable to me.
Yeah, we've kind of gone back and forth on that. We were using the research grade ones, but I know one species in particular that I looked at was mostly found in the eastern US, and we had one point in Boulder, Colorado. And when I zoomed in on it on Google Maps, it was like in somebody's yard. So it was likely somewhere that someone had planted it and was watering it. And so, yeah, it's an accurate identification, but that's not the species occurring out in natural conditions. And so, yeah, I think that the jury is still out on that. And maybe that's, you could look at those occurrences, but you may want to be more, look into them a little more before you decide.
Gotcha.
That's one thing that we've been thinking about looking at. Is there's some packages in R where you can look at outliers, where we could do a more of a deep dive to see whether or not we should really be including those outliers or not. And so that could be a way to analyze that type of data.
Gotcha. And I will take this opportunity to tell everyone online here that if you're out in the field and you're seeing these things, we can't do this kind of work without georeference data. So put those points in your ed maps, take if it's a plant, go get that thing vouchered. Okay, question here. Why did you use a +2 degrees C and 4 degrees C temperature scenarios to represent the future climate instead of downscaled CGM temperatures?
We used those because that was it was a similar climate data set to what we've already been using in INHABIT, and was readily available with the 2C and the 4C, where someone else had already done the downscaling and the getting it all ready to use.
Gotcha. Okay, this is from Stas. Great to see this work. We're especially interested in looking at the relationship between invasives and fire. Many of these species are already on your list, and some regions have very good models that combine suitability models with fire risk. For areas with less developed models, I was curious how far you could push the abundance models as a proxy for density of an invasive species within a landscape, as a rough proxy, and thinking about areas with high versus low continuity for fuel.
I think the big distinction there is that these models are potential habitat suitability, even with the abundance, and not necessarily where it is on the landscape or what it's going to get to. And so I've done a little bit of modeling with invasive grass and fire, and we've used the habitat suitability model in combination with the spread model from current distributions to decide where we might let populations grow through simulations and that sort of thing. So I think they can be useful in that way, but I think using just the straight up suitability model probably isn't the best thing, because it isn't going to reflect true ground conditions.
Gotcha. I will ask another question. Knowing, just full disclosure, Catherine and I are working on projects together for these horizon scan, national horizon scans. So my question is there any interest within the INHABIT group to take some of these lists of things that aren't here yet and try to get them into the database with their models?
Yeah, so that's something we're hoping to do, and hoping to partner with the plant horizon scan that's going on right now of species that are in trade being brought into the US. Ones that are identified as high risk would be good candidates for us to do these more in-depth modeling exercises for, using that global occurrence information and global predictors.
And possibly a way to incorporate climate change into that work as well, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And that would feed in well into the national framework for EDRR as well. And like, where should we be looking for what species showing up?
Right, right. We've got 15 minutes, folks, if you have any questions. Here we go, got a new one. You mentioned work with Wes Daniel on aquatics and pathways. Could you say more on how those pathways are being addressed or incorporated?
So that part is still under development, I guess. But right now we've just been collecting, we've identified the 100 species we're modeling, and we've been collecting information on secondary pathways for those species. And I think where those could be incorporated is looking at kind of future risk. We have information on where future suitability for a species might be. And if it's a species that mostly has natural pathways, if there's not a connection between like the hydrologic zones of where it currently is and where it might be in the future, then maybe that would have a lower risk of moving there versus if it's a species with some human mediated pathway and there's a lot of movement between those two locations, then it would have a higher risk assigned to it.
Follow up, is it how accurate and possible is it to model the human mediated, given humans are unpredictable?
I think that's a good question, but one study I really liked from a few years ago now was work done by John Bossenbrock looking at where zebra mussels might first appear in the West using a gravity spread model and information on, you know, where kind of boat traffic, where people take their boats between different bodies of water. And his model predicted where mussels did first appear in the Western US. And so I think there is some, those can at least be somewhat useful.
Mm-hmm. I would guess you could do that with railway and yeah. Okay, here we go. From Janet, first, thank you from MDC EEL program for your work with the Tegu studies. My question is, are you looking to add Mycania micrantha to the species list in INHABIT?
If people, if that's a species people would like us to add, then sure.
Yeah, do you want me to? Folks, you can put your requests in the chat and I'll take them. I'll take note. I have a couple I was thinking of. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? We've got some time for questions. All right, I guess we can wrap it up a little early here. I just want to note that all of these webinars are I said taped. I just showed my age. All of these webinars are recorded and are available on our website. And I believe we're in discussion of starting a YouTube channel as well to make it easier to access. So please reach out if you'd like to join the listserv if you haven't already. And join us this summer for the workshop. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.